Okay, if you went to our very first webinar, you're familiar with this quote: racism is a structure, it is not an event. It is a system that is upheld by policies, practices, unfair laws, and it takes on a life of its own, right? It's created by individuals, but once this system becomes a structure, it begins to have power regardless of the individuals in the system. So I'm going to try to explain that a little bit. So systemic racism is about these institutionalized policies, practices, and laws. They are embedded in organizations. So it could be an organization like Penn State, for example. It could be an organization like your church. It could be something like the local government. And each of these organizations has particular policies and practices that they follow. And we will see how in the past, racism has been embedded into the structure of our government, for example, throughout time. Okay, so that's the institutionalized part. And once that part becomes established, it doesn't really matter who the individuals are in that organization or that group. The policies already exist. So the individuals are participating in it simply by upholding the policies. So we're going to look at this and show how systemic racism is part and parcel of most of the organizations, all of the institutions of our country, and it works in a way that it oppresses Black people, Indigenous people, other peoples of color with a lack of power. And over time, on average, it privileges white people with power and privilege. So systemic racism it's hard to talk about because it's hard to see, but what's not hard to see are the results of systemic racism. And what we see is that there is an unequal access to goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. And if you saw our first talk on this, I showed you slides about wealth inequality and how white families on average have 10 times more wealth than Black families on average. So the white families were at $170,000 a year in wealth, and Black families were at about $17,000 a year in wealth. So you see the results of systemic racism, but it's awfully hard to point to it's meant to be obscured, actually, that we're not supposed to see it. And why is that? Why is that some people can't see systemic racism? And in particular, white people can't see systemic racism because we're often not the recipients of the racism. We're not the recipients of the unequal access to goods, services in society. But there's a couple beliefs that back this up. And so historically, people have believed that racists are bad people, that it's going to be obvious who's a racist because they're going to be a bad person. And that's not true. Because of how systemic racism operates, there's all kinds of, quote, good people, good Christians, nice people who are operating in a way that upholds systemic racism. So it's not always going to be obvious. And also the second thing is that people often believe that racism is a conscious dislike and an individual action, that it's something that's an active dislike. And that's not true. Again, how systemic racism operates is that it's kind of invisible, it's kind of obscured. And so you're not often consciously aware of how much you're contributing to systemic racism. And then lastly, we really have to understand the power of socialization in the United States. Each one of us on this phone call has been socialized into our gendered actions, our racial actions. And that begins even pre-birth. So let me just give you a little tiny bit about how powerful socialization is. Many of you may have taken, Soc 101 or Psych 101 at some point in your lives, and you may have heard of the story of Jeannie and other children like her. These were these young girls who were born and they were cared for physically, but they were not interacted with at all. They were kept in closets, they were kept in dark places, And they lived to be 7, 8 years old before they were discovered. So they had no interaction whatsoever. And when they were finally found, what the practitioners, the healthcare workers, and the researchers found is that these young girls, they were all girls, had no, they weren't able to walk, they weren't able to talk, and they had no affect. So the point of this is that it lets you know that everything is learned. Even our emotional reactions are learned. Sure, anger is something that is inside of us and everybody experiences, but how you express anger, how you express joy, all those things are learned, because we found with these girls who had no interaction with the outside world or with any other humans, they hadn't even learned how to express emotion. So think about when you're with little kids and like a toddler is running down the sidewalk or something and he falls and he hits his chin. And he always, they look up at you as the parent or the caregiver. They know it hurts, but they're not sure how they should react. And if you're like, oh, you're okay, they sort of smile and go on their way. But if you look at them and say, oh, are you okay? They start crying. And so these are just examples to show you how strong socialization is. So in your mind right now, you can think back to your own childhoods, to the TV ads, to TV shows, and how women were portrayed, how Black women were portrayed, how people of color were portrayed. And all of that has a powerful impact on how we see race and racism. So that's another reason why white people don't often see it, because racism is often portrayed on TV or in movies, for example, as being this individual action. Okay, so let's just, to make that, systemic racism come to life, I'm going to give you just one example that does not have to do with the church. And it has to do with health inequalities and health inequities. And it's something that everybody's familiar with, which is, of course, COVID-19. So I said that systemic racism is embedded in laws, policies, and practices. So it's not just individuals. So historically, there was a law and also a policy called redlining, where banks were given these maps and told not to give loans to Black families in particular and other families of color in these particular areas. And so Black home ownership, as a result, is significantly lower than white home ownership. And we know that there is so much residential segregation that it persists to this day because of that historical law and that historical practice of mortgage lenders not lending to Black people and people of color. In fact, if you dig a little bit deeper on that, there have been many cities that had these covenants where people sold their houses and wrote in a covenant to say that this house can never be sold to a person of color or to a Black person. And there is a lot of justice work being done right now to undo those covenants. So what is the practice? Well, the practice over time is that neighborhoods continued to be segregated. I mean, obviously there were laws around segregation in the Jim Crow era, but the practice is that neighborhoods are still segregated. They're under, though, euphemisms now, like we want to have a neighborhood with good schools or with, good jobs. But again, that's why racism is a little bit obscure, because we don't often call it race anymore. We call it something else, but the practice itself has ramifications. So how does this lead to unequal access to the goods and services of opportunities? Well, a lot of those neighborhoods are crowded living situations, which we know is detrimental for COVID-19. Places that have high population density have higher rates of COVID-19. Those places, which I showed you in the first webinar, if you were here, have much higher rates of pollution, of lack of clean air, and more toxicity. They also have, I could have shown you another map that shows that they have less access to medical care in those areas as well. So not easy access to good medical care. And they're also food deserts. So there's not a lot of access to healthy foods. So I'm sort of a visual person. I want to just show you visually what this looks like. Again, the policy and the practice was redlining and lack of mortgages for Black families and other families of color. So I'm just taking Milwaukee here to look at the red areas is where people of color actually were living, and the blue and the green areas are the better quality areas where they were not able to get loans. Then you can see that if you put socioeconomic status, if you take that map and overlay it, you can see that those areas today are also the lower SES areas, and the higher ones are along where the blue was. And then if you look at the population density, which we know is very detrimental to COVID-19 rates and COVID-19 deaths, you can see that to this day, that same history, that same policy and practice led to a higher population density. I could have also put a racial ethnic map here, and it would have shown that there's higher rates of African Americans and people of color in those areas. So that's just to show you how systemic racism kind of works, right? You can't point to an individual here and say, oh, it's the mayor of Milwaukee, you know, he's the problem or she's the problem. No, it's a law, it's a practice that existed and has all of these outcomes that continue to persist and have negative consequences for people of color. So if you'll just bear with me and let me be my data nerd for a minute here and show you how systemic racism looks. So here is a great chart here. If you look at the blue line, that is the percentage of the US population by racial ethnic group. So for example, white non-Hispanics make up 60% of the population, and Latinos make up 18% of the population, and Black African American non-Hispanics make up 13% of the population. So all things being equal, if we didn't have systemic racism, if we didn't have social determinants of health like, you know, lack of clean air, population dense neighborhoods, etc., all things being equal, that yellow line should be the same height as the blue line, right? The cases of COVID-19 for white people should be about 60% of the population, but you can see it's significantly lower for the white population. And then looking at Hispanic Latino, it is about double the rate. So the people getting COVID-19, it's double in that population, and it's much higher in the Black population. So Black Americans make up 20% or almost a fifth of COVID-19 cases, and yet they only make up 13% of the population. So you can see, sort of all things being equal, these numbers would be the same, but they're not. So that indicates that there's some inequities happening here. Okay. So in summary, systemic racism in the US, it preserves the social and economic inequality that already exists. It continues to recreate it over and over again. And as individuals in that system, the more we participate in the system, the more we don't dismantle the system, the more it continues to operate. And the thing is that I mentioned about socialization. This system is deeply rooted also in our culture and our belief systems. So it becomes part and parcel of the culture and values that we have in the US, unless we actively learn to change them. So this next piece is looking at the church. So we know we have a hope that the church is the bride of Christ. That's what we put out there as our hope. We can picture the bride of Christ in the book of Revelation, and we know that's how God sees the bride of Christ. But we also have to look through the rubble, right? We have to acknowledge that there has been systemic racism in the church, and it continues to impact not just the people in the church, but people outside the church that look to the church for values and beliefs and knowledge. So we're going to be looking at the church as an institution and just doing, really just touching upon some examples. So a lot of you on this phone call, I think, did the Racial Unity Network study on The Color of Compromise by Jemar Tisby. And when I finished that book study, and my husband and I were in the same group, he made the comment that we shouldn't put this book on the shelf, that we should keep this book out and we should reference it as much as we can because of what was covered in the book. It was so important. And this quote from Jemar Tisby kind of sums up the history of racism in the church and what we need to really lament about and acknowledge in the church. So he says here, not only did white Christians fail to fight for Black equality, they often labored mightily against it. And we're still living with, we have to acknowledge that similar to the 240 years of racism in the United States, we have to acknowledge the legacy of systemic racism in the church so that we can work towards rebuilding the church on an equitable foundation. Okay, one thing that comes up though when we talk about racism, systemic racism and prejudice in the church, a lot of white folks start to feel white guilt. And we know from our research and just teaching this for many, many years that white guilt can often stop the conversation. Guilt often leads us to not act. We feel guilty, and so we don't want to act. We kind of want to hide. But Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 7:10 that what we want is godly grief, this godly grief that produces a repentance that leads to salvation without regret, whereas worldly grief produces death, which is why we're talking about this and praying about it, because we don't want to get stuck in white guilt. We want to move into prayer and action and change, and that is part of godly grief. Right, so just continuing that vein, why is it so hard to talk about systemic racism, especially with white people? I love this picture here of the railroad because sometimes when we talk about systemic racism in mixed groups, mixed racial groups, the conversation can get derailed. And we want to acknowledge that white responses to racism can often include fear, can often include this guilt. Sometimes people emotionally withdraw. Sometimes people literally leave the room. Sometimes there is a very strong emotional reaction. And so the conversation gets centered around the white experience again, instead of it staying on the conversation of racism. And so that is one thing we want to make sure that we do, is to not derail the conversation and try to keep the focus on looking at racism in the church, even though we know it's hard. And it is hard, but we're going to persevere. Okay, so we have to remember that the church in America and slavery in America, they've been here since before the Union was formed. They've been here, they kind of grew up together in our country. So people came here as Christians and people were brought here as slaves at the same time. And so slavery in the United States took on a particular characteristic of the Black slaves being treated as chattel, treated as property. We know when the country was finally founded, slaves only counted as 3/5 of a person. So what this did was it started that whole beginning of the dehumanization of Blackness, the dehumanization of Black people. And the problem that started with Christianity at that time is that slave owners and other white individuals in the community were trying to evangelize their slaves. They were preaching freedom in Christ to slaves without granting them freedom. They were, dividing their minds here by teaching them one thing about Christ, but not actually giving their freedom. And I want to say this is very peculiar because I know some of you go to other countries and you speak to people who actually also don't have freedom, and you're talking to them about Christ, but you don't actually have the ability to grant them freedom. You can just tell them about Jesus. Whereas these slave owners actually had the ability to grant that freedom in the natural world. And so there was quite a bit of hypocrisy, and Black Americans knew that and they experienced that. And so that led to a lot of mistrust in the beginning, and already going to be some splitting of the church even before the churches got really established. So slavery was from the beginning of the United States, as you know, and it lasted for 240 years. I know I've already said that once, but I cannot say it enough to understand that the legacy of that, how that cannot be undone quickly and easily. And the legacy of that is right alongside the history of, you know, the church and other institutions, our educational institution, our criminal justice institution, you know, they all grew up together. So we really have to work at dismantling them. In the 1700s, the Baptist General Committee of Virginia did come out and make a statement. In 1785, they opposed slavery and they said, you know, we are against this. It is against the law of God. But what happened very quickly was a backlash. And for those of you that have worked for any length of time in this work and or even have observed it, any conversation around anti-racism or working against racism, it results in a backlash. There's always a backlash. We can pray against that backlash. Let's do that. But there was a backlash almost immediately that slave owners in those congregations demanded rights to their property. And they began to utilize the Bible in a way that they said the Bible defended or at least did not prohibit slavery. So what happened was in 1790, the Baptist General Committee first said that each congregation could decide themselves their own policies and stances independently. So they did not come out, or they retracted what they said. And eventually they decided that slavery was a civil issue outside the scope of the church. So it's sort of the beginnings of the separation of church and state, and we understand the importance of that. However, the church could have continued to make a stance that it was immoral. So there's the complicity. I mean, this was in the late 1700s, and we know that slavery legally went on for nearly another 100 years, and the church had the opportunity to work towards ending it much, much sooner. So this is a real place where there is some lamenting and some repentance. So after slavery ended, after the Civil War ended, of course, we know from history that not everyone was freed at once. It took, you know, many, many years for slaves to be freed all throughout the country. And then eventually we were in Reconstruction for a very short period of time, but eventually that was abolished and Jim Crow laws became the law of the land, right? We started to have new laws that legalized the separation of Black and white Americans. It's interesting to note, though, immediately post-Civil War, Black women especially were interested in pursuing their educations and pursuing reading as a way to finally read their Bible. So for them, this was part of growing their faith. But of course, we had the landmark case of Plessy versus Ferguson that resulted in separate but unequal, ultimately, institutions for Black and white Americans. So, whoops, sorry, gotta go back for a second. So we had the rise of the Jim Crow laws, and you can see from this image here that we had churches, though white churches, many of them did not welcome people of color, who were back then called colored people. We don't use that term anymore because it is a term that is denigrating to people of color. At the same time, though, we have to talk about lynching, because this is another place where the church, their policies and practices did not abolish lynching. So how does lynching work? Well, obviously it's terror. Obviously people are killed, but from a psychological point of view, Black Americans were terrorized by lynching through the random acts of violence. So we know from psychology that violence works. It doesn't have to be every single day or every week or even every month. It's the randomness. It's the not knowing when it's going to happen and the horrificness of it combined that work to terrorize a people and keep them in a constant state of fear. And we see this to this day, actually, these deaths that we keep seeing happening over and over again in the news that are such terrible acts of violence, like George Floyd's death. And they don't have to happen every single month, though it seems like they do. They just have to happen randomly and enough to keep people in fear. And so that's how lynching worked. And the church maintained silence and avoidance on this issue. In fact, some of these lynchings took place on the property of Black churches with the acquiescence of community members who were in white churches. Black preachers were often targeted, and the church itself failed to unequivocally condemn lynching. Now, certainly there were congregations that did, and there were pastors that did. Absolutely, right? We know that individuals certainly stepped up, but we're talking about the systemic piece here, and there was no large scale, unequivocal condemnation of lynching. And so you could argue, and Tisby does argue, that lynching really couldn't have survived without the silence of the American church. It's sort of similar to what we're experiencing today, and which is why we're, talking about this to change that. So systemic racism, as we said, includes policies and practices that oppress one group and privilege another. And so slaves had to meet in hush arbors, for example, or if they did meet in the church, they couldn't meet at the same time as the white church members. They were often maltreated in the churches. Preaching tended to reinforce sort of a white supremacist worldview. So that's how, it's embedded in our cultural beliefs and values. And so there's always, with systemic inequality, systemic racism, you have to also understand there's always opposition. The oppressed groups are going to form and create their own expression, their own ways of being. They're still beings with some agency, with some power. And so what happened was we had a systemic response to systemic racism, and that was the formation of Black churches. So in the early 1700s, Black people took, of course, a different stance on slavery, wanted to condemn it outright. And so there was the creation of new denominations, Black denominations, like the African Bethel Church in Philly and the AME Church in Philly. And if you look at how long ago these were started, even before or right around the creation of our country, and certainly before the Civil War. And so this was the Black response to systemic racism, was to create their own churches. Most Blacks did leave the white church en masse after the Civil War, and they today still attend a mostly African American church. And we know from our own data that also white people attend mostly white churches. Okay, so in summary, the church is an institution that has a history of systemic racism, and systemic racism operates through its policies, practices, procedures, laws. And so we have to work to examine those policies, practices, and procedures. That's kind of us looking through the rubble in order to rebuild the church. And so now I'm going to hand it over to Rumbi, who's going to give us some ideas from the Black women's groups that were formed right around the same time that I'm talking about. And she's going to talk to us about how we can learn more of how to combat systemic racism. So Rumbi, you can ask to share the screen, I guess. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you. Hi, as Dr. D has said, I'm Rumbidzai Njanike, and I'll be giving lessons from Black Women's Club for this part of the presentation. I decided it was necessary to learn about this topic because Black women's clubs can set an example of a response to systemic racism. And most importantly, they created social and political change through 3 points: community support, representation, and advocacy. I'll get more into detail of those later on, but I'll give you a quick overview of these three. They were able to show community support through volunteer work, which allowed them to have a connection to the community, meaning it wasn't only within the church, but even those outside of the church. They were also able to show representation through opening and creating opportunities, which force inclusion within this type of community. And they were also able to show advocacy by demanding rights for those who had multiple systems of oppression against them, which allowed them to have an understanding of intersectionality. I just want to give a quick understanding of Black women's clubs. Black women's clubs are organizations that stem off of Black churches and are mainly composed of middle-aged Black women who devoted this time to welfare activities. They became a big thing in the late 19th century, and they were a grassroots organization, meaning that they would, the people within that community that possessed a few resources decided to share or give them to others that didn't in order to have everyone on equal grounds. And the welfare activities consisted of supporting acts for missing things due to racism. Therefore, it made it necessary for fundraisers and petitions for educational materials because during that time, Jim Crow made it that it was unequal resources given to predominantly Black institutions compared to white. Therefore, there was a need for books, playground areas, proper class to teacher ratio, and much more. In addition, the Black women's clubs were able to produce meetings with white schools in order to put pressure on changing the lack of resources given to these predominantly Black schools. Next, I have health centers. Black women's clubs were able to give medical, dental, and mother's health resources to those within the community. Additionally, they were able to give nursing services, and they were able to provide campaigns that they were left out of due to Jim Crow laws, such as anti-tuberculosis and Red Cross. Next, I have home improvement and cleanup. With this, they made it necessary to try to reduce pollution within the community or environmental toxins, or even just fixing a few things within people's homes. And the reason why I wanted to give these examples is not only because it was good for community support, but it allowed for representation to be shown in multiple ways. These programs allowed for Black people to be put into positions that were outside of society's norm at that time, even leadership positions, as we can see. And it allowed for there to be church to community connection due to people working within the church and people working outside of the church as well. Next, I want to go into get into it on a national level so that we understand that this work wasn't only within neighborhoods, but also outside of it. So Black women's clubs were actually able to put together the National Baptist Convention, and it was like a meeting place for Black churches to come together and talk about national issues during that time. There was produced the National Baptist Magazine, where they talked about Black history, lynching, presidential elections, industrial education, and much more. And even with this, Black church women had impressive numbers when it came to protesting against racist and sexist prescriptions. And due to this growth in advocacy, or even the attention, there was a growth with Black journalists as well. One of the important ones being Ida B. Wells. She was a leader of the early civil rights movement. One of her most important works were anti-lynching crusades, where she gave speeches and talked about lynching and how it was used to instill fear in Black people, similar to what Dr. G was saying, so white people could maintain their power. Meaning these acts were carried out if a Black person had the right to vote, if they were too successful, or even being at the wrong place at the wrong time. So her anti-lynching crusades and her early civil rights activism had a heavy influence on creating a national foundation, such as the National Association of Colored Women.
Oh, I think I have it. There you go.
The National Association of Colored Women is a social and political activism organization. Their motto is lifting up as we climb. They mainly advocated against sexism and racism, meaning that they supported right to vote for all Americans, anti-lynching legislations, and educational rights at a higher institutional level. The first president of that organization was Mary Church Terrell. Women like her and Ida B. Wells were able to lead the organization to such success that they joined forces with men and created the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And the reason why I want to bring this out is because it shows how impactful these Black women's clubs were. Starting out from a church within small neighborhoods, they were able to come onto a wider scale and be a support for other people, not only just for people within their neighborhood, but outside of that. And then next, I will let Dr. D give some statistics on how involved Black women are within the church.
Yes, thank you, Rumbi. So a recent research shows that 9 out of 10 African-American women consider living a life of faith to be the most important thing in their lives. And 74% of Black women versus only 57% of white women consider living a life of faith to be the most important thing in their lives. So these, the lessons we can learn from these Black women's clubs and Black women for the church is important. So Rumbi is going to give us a few lessons here. I'll put them all. How's that?
For this part, I just want to give it a conclusion. As we know, as we saw, Black women's clubs felt as though it was important to have community support. And the reason for this, I believe, is because in the Bible, we know that it always talks about how what makes the church isn't the building, but the people. And I want to put importance of body of people. And from 1 Corinthians 12, we know that it makes a similarity between a human body and the body of people within the church. And that the human body is made up of different parts, such as the hands, arms, legs, and feet. And just because the foot is different from the hand, we don't break it off because it still has value to it. It still gives us that support we need. It still allows us to function. Therefore, we can apply this to the church. It's better to have all the parts instead of only one part within the church, because then when we have a diverse church, then we have more stability and we're able to function better.
Nice.
And just from my own perspective, just to give my own experience, in talking about the body, it makes me realize how out of the body that I do feel. I feel as though in order to make myself part of the body, I have to change who I am just to fit in. And for example, even doing this PowerPoint, when Dr. D asked me, and we were even going through a run through, I was realizing that I was code switching in order to make people feel comfortable while I was feeling uncomfortable myself, because this is such an important topic. I don't want to sugarcoat anything. It's necessary that I provide you guys with all the facts, and it shows just how important this information is to me, and that you guys actually take it in, understand it, and apply it to your church, so that other people, other Black women, won't have to feel as though they have to change when they want to be with their own brothers and sisters, as we like to call ourselves. They can actually fit in within the family.
Oh, that's so important, Rumbi. So important. We're getting into what can we do? And, I love how Rumbi's bringing up that we are family and we are brothers and sisters, but some people don't feel comfortable being themselves in the body of Christ. So what can we do about that? Thank you so much, Rumbi. So that's kind of where we are, is this, how do we change things? I'm just so thankful that Rumbi shared her story and is willing to share that with us, because she knows, and we've talked a lot about, if we want to get from the rubble of systemic racism and racism in the church and the broken body, and we want to get to restoration, first of all, we know that the God of heaven has to be the one who grants us success, right? He's got to be with us, but it's not really a straight line. It is a really complicated arrow. And there is no, I just want to say on this last part, there isn't an easy answer. We're going to try to give you guys some ideas, and then we'll let you ask questions. But here's what the framework that we're using does come out of the Tisby book. So again, for those of you that studied it, you might remember his arc of racial justice, awareness, relationships, commitment. It's a framework for racial restoration in the church. And so we're pulling out some ideas. The first one is awareness. So kind of what we're doing tonight, researching and understanding systemic racism, historical racism, but also researching these groups that are not part of your church currently and hearing about their histories and the impact that they have had on church. So, Rumbi's part of this presentation talking about the history of Black women's clubs is part of that learning, part of that awareness to recognize that people of color in systemic racism are oppressed on average, but they also have a lot of power and agency and a lot of creativity. As part of this, I just want to say that I know in Calvary's message yesterday, Pastor Dan talked about just keep going. And that's really a big part of what we have to do with awareness. We have to just keep going. It's easy for white people to not keep going because they're not often the recipients of systemic racism. And so it's a commitment that people have to make to continue to learn, to continue to do the research and listen to the talk so you can vigorously combat systemic racism in the body of Christ and work to heal the body. The second thing under awareness is kind of a practice that Rumbi and I have taught and also utilized in our own work. I've taught it a lot in my classes. So it's this practice of decentering whiteness. And you can use this. So this is a practical tool. You're finally going to get something to write down practically. You can use this in your church, in your organization, in your club, whatever it is. It's something that I physically do with my classes, but you can just do it even mentally with your organization. So let's look at the pyramid on the left there, the hierarchy. So we know there's a hierarchy in the United States and actually around the world, with white people at the top and white men in particular at the top in general, on average, in terms of power and privilege. And then people of color are at the bottom of the pyramid. And so one thing we know about hierarchies, and you could do this with your group. I actually do it with my class where I physically have them get into a hierarchy. Some people volunteer to do this. They'll get on a table, they'll stand on a chair. And what happens in a hierarchy is that the people at the top don't have to understand the people below them. They're at the top, so they're looking out ahead. But the people below in the hierarchy, they have to understand their own position and all the ones above them. And so W.E.B. Du Bois calls this double consciousness. It's the idea that you have to know your own groups, culture, beliefs, attitudes, etc., and you have to know the dominant groups. And so that's what Rumbi was talking about with code switching. People of color often they have double consciousness. They have to do this code switching between the culture, values, ways of talking in their cultural group, as well as having to know the dominant group. And so when you decenter whiteness, you cut down on that code switching. And what you can do, the exercise is you take another group, like in our case, African-American women, Black women, and you put them in the center. And you go through your policies, practices, procedures, and you look at how would it be different based on the experiences of this group. And you want to use the demographics of your area, but you can reframe. You can look at what can we learn? How can we be enriched? How can our group change? What policies, practices, procedures would we change by centering this other group? How would our worship change? How would our welcome change? How would our meetings change? And you can't really do this in a vacuum, though. That's the thing. You have to really study the group. Maybe you don't know anybody in that group. If it's like, if you live in an area that has a lot of Indigenous women and you don't know really anything about Indigenous women, you have to study the group. Also, you could use focus groups. Now, ideally, a white person like myself, I've done focus groups and I've done them with students of color at Penn State, but I often leave the room. I usually leave the room, right? Because the minute I enter the room, there's code switching and there's the double consciousness. So I leave the room and kind of let the camera do its thing and just video record them. And I ask them questions like, what's your experience been at Penn State? What's your experience been as a, biobehavioral health student? And just let them talk. And again, like I said, removing decentering whiteness, pulling that out of the room. So you want to, look at your own local body of Christ, your own local organization, and look at the demographics of that region and kind of take your organization through this practice. You might want to hire like an outside facilitator to help you through the process. So that's one thing you could do. The second part is relationships, and this was our last talk, and we might do one in the future again if you guys are interested in more about allyship and friendship, and of course prayer is a big part. We're not going to get into this today because we're looking at systemic stuff, but you could also go back to your Color of Compromise book or get one if you want. He's got a lot of ideas in there. And then lastly, commitment. So this is again, back at that structural systemic level. Tisby asks the question, are you willing to address systemic and institutional aspects of racism rather than just working at the interpersonal level? Are you willing to correct historic wrongs and the ongoing ramifications? So he recommends, first of all, issuing statements that speak out against racism and violence against Black people. So really, making a stand, making a statement. And we've seen that as a church this summer, some churches doing that, including some of our own. But secondly, he says we could participate in reparations. So there's civic reparations that we could certainly support as a church or as a group. So Holocaust survivors, for example, were given billions of dollars in reparations. Japanese Americans in the United States who spent years in internment camps during World War II, they lost their businesses and their homes, sometimes their families. They were given tens of thousands of dollars in reparation from the US government. And so pursuing that for other groups, Indigenous groups, Black Americans, and other disenfranchised groups. Though he also talks about ecclesiastical reparations, so reparations within the church or that the church could participate in. And in Matthew 5:24, Jesus tells us that it's so important to heal our divisions that even before we go to worship, even before we bring our worship to the altar, we should go heal our differences with our brothers and sisters. So it's so important that we consider something like debt forgiveness. Maybe we could look at families in our community and find out who has quite a bit of debt forgiveness to reduce that wealth gap. And we might use some of our money to reduce debts. We could fund Black-led church plants. And this one's very important to me as an educator of students of color at Penn State. I've met many students of color, especially Black students who come to school, come to college, and they've been raised in a church, but they don't have fellowship when they get to Penn State. They don't find a place to plug in and find a place where they can be themselves in the body of Christ. So maybe we could fund a Black-led church plant even here in Center County. We could fund Black pastors. So research shows that Black pastors often have to be bivocational because, again, because of that wealth gap, that their communities often cannot pay a full salary. And so maybe a white church could partner with a Black church first. And then finally, looking for ways to pay tuition for Black students and other students of color to go to Christian colleges, which are often private and costly. And so finding ways to support them in going to a college that will support their faith. So in summary, we've got some practical things that you could do at a group level, at a community level, at an institutional level that you can, go home and look at your own organization and maybe decenter whiteness, or maybe look at how to fund some reparations. But of course, taking all this in prayer first to God, for your own self and for your community, and seeking his direction for your group and your organization. So we thank you guys for coming. We are going to have time for some Q&A. And so now, if you want to use the chat, I didn't get to see any of the chat. Darn it. Oh, right. I did say to post prayers, but I guess. Oh, thank you, Megan, for putting a prayer in there. And Eric for putting a prayer in there. So please use the chat for continued putting prayers in there, or scriptures that came to you that were important. And or now you can go ahead and ask a question in the chat if you would like to. Or if you can figure out how to raise your hand, you can do that. If you go to participants, you can actually raise your hand.
There's a question in there.
Oh, where's the question, Eric? I don't see it. Typical white churches do repeatedly. Is that the question? What do typical white churches do repeatedly that's most problematic? Is that the question, Eric?
That's the question. Yeah.
Okay. Rumbi, do you want to answer that one?
I believe, like, for one example is when a church doesn't actually say anything about racism that goes on. They, like we said before, they choose to ignore it and instead try to say, we'll just pray it over it instead of actually putting action into it as well. I think that's like a big problem. Like, or also expecting Black people to automatically forgive, like, all things that have happened but are still even happening, but they don't realize it. I feel like that's also another problematic thing within white churches, always expecting Black people to be so forgiving and like nice and welcoming, like, to white churches or white people in general, even though we still have many problems going on.
Yeah, I want to speak to that too and just say that there is a lot of lack of trust. And I hope that this just little tiny bit of history showed that, there's good reason for lack of trust. There's good reason for, lack of not feeling safe. And I think these calls that we're doing now for unity, like we call this the Racial Unity Network, that's good. It shows our heart for unity, but it assumes that it puts kind of a lot of pressure on, people of color to unify instead of, the white church doing some work first. I guess that's what I'm kind of arguing here, is that I think the white church or white people in churches need to do a lot of work first, because it's putting a lot of pressure on people of color just to say, oh yeah, we're going to meet you halfway, when there has been this long history. Other questions? You guys are so quiet. Nobody wants to. Let me get out of this, because I did have some questions from the seminar. Anyway, go ahead. Someone else can ask a question.
There's another question in the chat.
Oh, can you read it out loud? Because I'm looking at this.
The term code switching was used.
Oh.
Can you explain this term more?
Sure. Yes. Thank you. Rumbi,
Maybe for Rumbi.
Yeah.
Well, with code switching, I would say it's putting on, like, if I were not to be like very academic with it, I would say it's putting on a white person voice when you get around white people. You don't use your slang or your own like terminology that you do when you're around, like in your neighborhood or when you're with other Black people. And also, in a sense, like I said, like sugarcoating some of the things you say so that it's more comfortable for white people when they hear the things about racism, or if you even have a problem at all. So it's like code switching in a way to fit for white people rather than just being yourself and then truly expressing the way you feel or
And
being
it's,
able to express yourself.
no, go ahead. I'm sorry, Rumbi, I talked over you. Go ahead.
I basically said the same thing, but like being able to truly express yourself, because we do use words and we use like our mannerisms and whatnot to give like the type of feelings that we are feeling at the time, to give off that emotion. But with code switching, it's like reducing it.
Mhm, mhm. And keep in mind that the code switch is to the dominant culture, the white culture. And so this idea that people of color have to always have that second language, so to speak. Yeah. And there's a fear that if they don't code switch, that they will be mistreated or considered inferior or judged harshly. So it's not even something that is happening in a free way. It's something that's being done out of, some fear of repercussions, I think. Let's see. Yeah, so Gary's adding, another thing that white churches currently do is not stand up for godly standards in the public sphere. When our president declared that there are good people on both sides of racist demonstrations, churches should feel obligated to condemn that. And so again, it kind of shows that same historical standard of, part of this is making a stance, being strong in making a stance there, issuing a statement, I guess. Oh, okay, intersectionality. That's your specialty, Rumbi, if you want to say that.
Intersectionality is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and she uses it to say that you need to understand that there are people within this world that have more than one system of oppression against them, such as someone being Black and then being part of the low SES. That will give something. But yeah, it's like multiple systems of oppression, like, oh, being Black and I'm a woman. So there I already have two systems of oppression against me.
Good.
I hope that was helpful.
And she also talks about how we all have differing levels of power and privilege depending on, where we are in those different systems of oppression. But that you have to address multiple systems of oppression. And I love the example that she gives. She talked about how Black women historically, if they wanted to file an equal opportunity complaint, had to either choose to file one as a Black person or a female. They couldn't file it as a Black female. Kind of the double jeopardy of having two types of oppression against them. And so people would have to choose. Even though they intersect, we need to look at them together at the same time. Would you say that's right, Rumbi?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, overlapping.
So Darlene asked about the double consciousness. Do you want to answer that or do you want me to answer that?
I feel like you would be best at answering.
Okay. So that's kind of the precursor to code switching, but it's what W.E.B. Du Bois talked about historically, that people of color have had to have a double consciousness. It's almost exactly like code switching, where they need to always be aware, they were socialized into their culture, but they had to always be conscious of the white dominant culture. And as they moved through the world, they had to be aware of places where they needed to be responsive to the white culture and could not react as maybe their family had been or they'd been raised culturally. They had to take on a different persona. Ooh. Oh. Okay, can we give an example of a policy within the church that's centered around a racial ethnic group? Liz, I'm so glad you're asking that, because the policies that uphold systemic racism don't often use the word race or ethnicity. And they're often not about race and ethnicity. They just tend to operate in a way that somehow excludes one group and includes another, or that is, let me think if I can think of an example. I should have had this ready to go. Can you think of one, Rumbi, that is a policy within the church?
I'm trying. think, but nothing is really coming if I were to be honest.
Well, I'm thinking of sort of like maybe like time schedules and how we view time in sort of the white dominant church. I know in like, I was raised Catholic, man, church starts at this time and it ends at this time, and that's that, whereas in historically, maybe still currently in Black centered churches, the concept of time or the policies around time are not as strict as they are in, for example, predominantly white churches. Ooh, good question. White privilege is a buzz phrase that can make people defensive. How would I broach it without alienating my white audience? Sharon, that's like the multi-million-dollar question. I mean, my short answer is to say, I just have to teach about it, whether I'm alienating them or not. But I get what you're saying. How do you talk to other people about white privilege without alienating them? I mean, I usually, when I talk about it, I just start to look at the examples. And I think if you have the examples in your, your back pocket, so to speak, so kind of memorizing some of the examples of how people with white skin walk through life with privileges that they don't even recognize. They're meant to be invisible. If you can just list like 5 or 10 examples, it really does disarm people because they realize, I never had to think about that. I never had to talk to my kids about, safety, getting pulled over by the policeman. I never had to talk to them about putting their hands on the dashboard immediately. Yeah, go ahead, Rumbi, and go ahead.
There's an example, Peggy McIntosh. She
Right.
had Unpacking Privilege. I think that's the title of it.
Yep.
You can look at it and it'll give like, I think there are about like 15 to 30 things on that list, which will make you be like, wow, like I didn't even realize I have that white, like that's white privilege, or I have that privilege compared to Black people.
Can we bring together Black churches with white churches? I mean, I'm going to let Rumbi answer this too, but Joy's iPad, that kind of goes back to this idea of, I think white churches now, a lot of people in white churches, rather, I should say, I can't speak for white churches. I think there is a movement towards wanting that unity. And yet what is the impetus for the Black churches right now to have that unity? How can we become more comfortable and not sugarcoat it? I think that we have to do the work, Joy, is what I would say. We have to keep doing the work. Rumbi's nodding her head. Go ahead. What do you think about that?
I was going to say, I think it shouldn't really, I don't think it can really start with trying to bring them together. More so, rather, once we see the action, then we'll be more open to actually trying to have that unity, I guess you could say, because it's like you could it could be very performative with how people advocate or how they're trying to show support for Black people. So it's really just the it comes from that mistrust again. We really need to see the actual work, like that you're there for us, you're supporting us, you're advocating for us. You're not just keeping quiet or staying out of it. You're actually doing the work in order for us to be more comfortable around each other.
Well, and also as white people doing the work to unpack our white privilege, to go back to, I forget who answered that question. As someone who has been teaching this and doing this, I'm still I don't know if I would say constantly, but I'm still having lots of interactions where I'm still contributing to systemic racism. Because I'm more aware of it, I see it more often, but it's still work that I have to do to not harm. When I'm part of systemic racism, I'm actually harming my Black brothers and sisters. And I've now that I'm again more aware of it, I can literally see the results of it. Yeah,
So in Rumbi, there's another question in here by an attendee that's quite long but very interesting. As far as racial and ethnic centered policies go, they were reflecting on a question mentioned earlier. I think about churches going on mission trips or collaborating on retreats only within their own denominations. due to the history of how denominations have developed in the US, that tends to mean churches only collaborate with other churches with a similar racial or ethnic population, even though that's not the intention. There's a lot of layers to that one, just the fact of mission trips. You could talk about that too. So
Well, I
there you
do
go.
like that this person, Kayla, is pointing out that when you look now, see, that's the importance of understanding the history, right? When you go back and look at the history and see how denominations were formed, you see that they were formed in response to systemic racism. And so if we just stick within our denomination, we're never going to really unpack and uncover and change that systemic racism. But once we know the history of it, we can say, wait a minute, we have to really work against that. Yeah, go ahead, Rumbi.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Like how you said it's like not the intention. That's how systemic racism is. It makes you think that's not the intention when really like behind it all, if you like peel back those layers and you look at the history, those were the intentions.
Oh, wow. Can we repeat that? I want to repeat that because even though it's not the intention now, when you peel back the history, you see that it was the intention originally. And so we have to literally do something different to get away from that intention now.
Yeah.
Boy, it's a good thing we're recording this, Rumbi, because I want to remember that quote. Yeah, and I think that was Curtis, who's run Zoom, who said there must be intentionality to develop multiracial, multi-ethnic churches. It is work to do, but worth the work.
With that.
So Eric wrote, I saw a chart today that shows how media attention to racism has dropped off substantially. And along with that, donations to groups focused on racism has decreased. How do we keep this going, as you say? Well, those of us on this phone call, we personally need to keep going. Our group needs to keep going. We need to just not get tired. I mean, as white people, we have the privilege to turn away from it if we want to, and we need to fight against that and keep going.
I also think it's important how like we said that white people do have privilege. So using that privilege to how can I say, to put more attention on people who actually do talk about this, who actually have like positions with activism, and connecting it to the church is important to like give them a platform in order to keep talking about it, or for the to keep going, like using that privilege to like to give it to someone else, in a way.
I like that recommendation. So if somebody on the leadership team is here, giving platform to people of color, to those voices, that's how we move forward. Yes, truly. How do we decenter our whiteness? So I think in every organization, I know Phil is part of like worship, in every small group, go through that exercise to think about your group. How would it look? How would it change if you took out whiteness from the center and you put another specific group into the center? How would your practices change? How would your like, I'm just going to pick on worship for a minute because I see Kim is here too. What songs might you sing? How might it flow? How might it be different? Would it be at different parts of the worship service? I don't know. I'm just saying, ask the question. Would you sing in, some churches would have things be more bilingual. I know that's not something necessarily that we have here in Centre County, but, certainly churches that are in those areas should consider that. What about you, Remy? Do you have something else on decentering whiteness?
I think, yeah, it like what you're saying applies literally like within the church, of how like even the way you might give a scripture for something, if it can apply to a racial problem that's going on right now, would you change it so that it can fit that, or are you just like going to move by and not talk about it? you know, doing that thing where you ignore the problems that are going on.
I think what I'm hearing is we have to get rid of silence. We have to get rid of avoidance. And that's part of the history of the church that we need to lament and repent and keep going and do better. Anyone in a position to be heard? Okay. Our meeting would like to work with the needs of people, but we are not, aside from interfaith. So how do we know the specific needs of a Black congregation? Are you talking about Black churches in general or Black people in general? Oh, let me just answer Curtis's question here. It can be seen as patronizing, right? But Curtis, you're doing it in your group, for example, and your group, you're not going to be, you're not going to do this in a vacuum, right? So you're going to be doing the research. You're going to be understanding that group first. You're going to try to learn as much as you can without being patronizing, right? So you have to kind of, definitely walk that fine line. But if you do have people in your larger group that you could do like a focus group with, that's different. You're empowering them and giving them a voice and asking them to, that you want to hear their voice, that you want to take your voice out of there and hear what they have to say. Do you want to add something to that, Rumbi? I'm looking at the other question.
I'm just trying to answer Lori's question.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think of how to answer it. I think in knowing the needs, honestly, I think it would just be like reaching out to those other Black churches within the area. Like Dr. D had like some of the examples of like, even what is it called? Giving to like Black pastors because sometimes they have to have another job and be a pastor because they're not making enough. That will like continue like Black churches going on. They'll actually see that you guys are supporting them, that you're listening to them. You actually care about keeping, like allowing them to have somewhere like a safe place to be, like somewhere they can be comfortable. And that'll be like them being more comfortable with you because you guys understand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just ask and listen.
What was that, Rumbi?
Someone said, to answer Louis' question, just ask and listen.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I just want to say, it sounds like for white folks, as we said earlier, I didn't mention that there's the discomfort, that's just kind of right. Asking, it's going to be uncomfortable. But somebody had the phrase of being comfortable. Oh, I think it's Dr. Francis, who's part of Calvary. That her opening slide of her whole semester is get comfortable with the uncomfortable. That's just part of her classes on diversity and health. And it's just part of the conversation is, especially for white folks, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. I wrote down there too, community health needs assessment. There's a ton of data in there broken down by race. And we have one that is done by Mount Nittany Hospital. Every hospital that is a nonprofit hospital has to collect that community needs assessment. So they have all kinds of demographic stuff in there for the community. Not necessarily church-based, but it would give you a sense of what the needs are in our community. So yes, we have like comment, the needs of Black churches, the same needs as all churches. Yes. All right, we are getting to the end of our time here. If anybody wanted to just ask anything else, I see Robin put in there Galatians 6:9. I'll be looking that up. Robin, I don't know it off the top of my head, but I know you know it. But I'll look it up as soon as we're done. If anybody else has any scriptures they want to put in there as an encouragement, that would be great. And you can also contact us through the Racial Unity Network website. We'll be happy to talk to you in the future if you would like that. So thank you all of you for coming. Thank you, Gary, for putting another scripture in there. It really is encouraging to us as we go forward. Okay, so thank you guys, and go ahead. Oh, let us not become weary in doing good. Thank you, Leslie. Perfect. Yes, and the racialunitynetwork.com. I thank all of you for coming, and we appreciate you all so much. And thank you so much, Rumbi, for being here and being our guest speaker tonight.
Yeah,
And
thank you for allowing me to come.
yes, we really appreciate you being here, and thank you for your voice and for your knowledge and all of your information. Okay. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. Have a good night, all of you.
Thanks so much. Good night.
Thanks, Phil.
Good night.
Rumbi, I'm going to call you in like 2 seconds.
Stay online.